So thanks so much for joining, everyone, and hopefully a few more people will trickle in as we get going. I'm Anna, so I coordinate WEAll Read, which is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance's book club, and Chloe has also just joined us, which is amazing. So yeah, it's great to have Chloe on the team as well. And then Lara is joining us to input and help out with the discussion. So that's fab. In terms of me, so I'm a sustainability consultant and I've just started a master's in economics and public policy and innovation, which is really exciting. For anyone who is might have any visual difficulties, I'm blonde and I'm wearing a black jumper. I think to start off with, it's been a tradition, or it's becoming a tradition rather, that in America people are acknowledging the land on which we come from. And I think it's worth thinking about how that can apply to Britain, and just to pause for thought to consider how Britain has contributed to kind of widespread suffering around the world, really, in the past, present, and future. So I think that's important to acknowledge, and hopefully sets us up for a very candid discussion. It'd be really nice to hear from you, Lucy, and then maybe pass on to someone else what brought you here, and yeah, what your background is and what brought you here.
Hi, thank you. That's a lovely introduction. I'm Lucy Philby. I work for SEPA, Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and I work with businesses on beyond compliance, so very much on what they're doing above and beyond their statutory requirements, and a lot of that takes me into kind of supply chain and places where they source things and people that work for them. So that was where my connection was. But I actually I'm bouncing from book club to book club. I've just finished the Volans book club, and I had a 30-minute break before coming to this one. But I am currently studying with Jenny Anderson through Power of Place. And it was actually that made me think that I would push myself and do 2 book clubs today and join this group, because it's actually a lot of what I'm learning on that course, and grappling with some of that made me really interested in this. So it's lovely to be here. And yeah, I'm based in East Ayrshire, so yeah. And I'm on my phone, so I can't really see anybody else. Hang on. I'll pass on to Doreen.
That's cheat. Thanks,
You were
Lucy.
first.
I'm Doreen Grove. I'm immensely old, for those who can't see me. I am part of WEAll Scotland. So I've been involved for a couple of years since we set it up. I'm on the board of trustees, and I love what Anna does with the book club, and I've never actually managed to make it before, so I'm really pleased to be here. And it's such an important discussion this evening. So my day job, I work for Scottish Government as head of open government, looking at how we improve democracies fundamentally. And I will pass to Laura. Yeah.
Hi, thanks, Doreen. I'm Lara Santos Ayllon. I met Anna at undergrad, and I've been invited to join today, which is great because I focused my master's research on the social justice dimensions of Scottish energy policy. And from there, I moved up to the Orkney Islands to work in stakeholder engagement at the European Marine Energy Centre. And I've just started a doctoral program through the Energy Technology Partnership, and it will be looking at the justice dimensions of emerging energy technologies. So I've done a bit of work and research on just transitions, but also on other frameworks of justice, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I will pass on to Jonathan.
Hey everyone, I'm a little bit late, just want to acknowledge that. And I'm assuming I'm just introducing myself and why I'm here, that kind of thing. Cool. So my name is Jonathan. I'm originally from Toronto. I'm currently based in Cape Town, South Africa. And I heard about this event because I saw it posted on Impact Hub, and the topic really interested me. I didn't do any reading, but I was thrilled to be joining anyway. Yeah, for work, I'm an executive coach. I work with a lot of founders and executive directors of nonprofits, mostly in the social justice space, but I'm very, very passionate about the environment. It's very important to me and our species' survival in that environment. So yeah, that's why I'm here, and to learn and to meet folks, and that's it. That's me. Am I passing it? Is there anyone else who hasn't had a chance to speak, or am I the last person?
Rachel, Catherine, or Chloe?
All right, let's do Rachel.
Thanks, Jonathan. This is my first WEAll book club. I volunteer with a charity called 2050 Climate Group, which I know Jane, who's a member of WEAll, was the founding member of that. And my volunteer role there, I deliver a young leaders development program, and we've had WEAll come and develop and deliver a workshop with us as well. So that's kind of how I heard about this, was through a post that Jane put on LinkedIn. And in my day job, I used to be an environmental consultant. However, I've just changed to a role at developing the Young Workforce Glasgow, which works to reduce youth unemployment. And I'm project managing a new project there called My Climate Path. And that is working with young people and employers to help them contextualise and understand the routes and pathways to the new green jobs of the future. So making sure that the workforce is ready for those jobs. So obviously just transition is a really important part of that, and working with employers that are as part of that transition, as well as traditional green employers as well. So yeah, no, really interested to be along today. I will pass on to Chloe.
Thanks, Rachel. My goodness, we've got incredible people here. It's so exciting. So also a friend of Anna's. That's how it's kind of all started. And Anna and I have done various different things together, and work as well. I finished my master's last year in environment, politics and development at SOAS. And I am now working in an environmental NGO called ChemTrust. So we do EU and UK advocacy on harmful chemicals. We work a lot with Scottish charities as well, because of your position as a devolved nation. It's quite politically useful to get better chemicals management through. I miss reading a lot, and one of the reasons for taking a bit more of a role rather than participant is getting a little bit more in touch with concepts I was able to read about with full joy at university. So I hopefully haven't butchered some of the readings today in my summary, but yeah, really looking forward to the discussion. Who has not yet been? Has Catherine been?
No.
No, hi everyone. Sorry. I'm Catherine Trebek, one of the co-founders with Doreen of WEAll Scotland, and one of the co-founders of WEAll Global. And Chloe, I loved your summary, thought it was great. I'm afraid I'm going to, Anna knows I always do this, like my one window to cook, and I'm about to start chopping up onions, so I'm going to keep the camera off, but I'm here listening attentively, but I don't want you to see all my panda eyes. It's not coming. WEAll read is such one of my favorite aspects of WEAll. WEAll is a very multifaceted organization, and I think this is just one of these little treasures in all its different facets, and really excited to meet you all. Cool. Back to you, Anna.
Thanks, Catherine. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining. I mean, it's actually really nice when we're a slightly smaller group, because you really get a sense of who's here, and just hearing the excuse me, the range of experiences, it's amazing. And what's really important to us, I think, is that we do sometimes have speakers, which is great, but actually it's all about kind of sharing the knowledge that we as a community bring to each other. So yeah, thanks for joining. So just a quick overview of how it will run. Chloe will do, and will kind of give us a summary of the main ideas from the readings as a refresher or an overview for anyone who's not read them. And then we'll open up a little bit to discussion and breakout rooms, or we might actually just stay together since we're just a few of us. And then Lara is really kindly going to talk us through some of what she's studying at the moment to do with justice and energy through her research as a PhD student up in Orkney. And then we'll kind of go into further discussion. And basically around 8:30, we can take a 5-minute break if you want to go get a beer. And then from 8:30 till 9, it's basically us just pretending we're in a pub and hanging out, chatting about whatever we would like, rather than keeping it really formal. I think because we used to meet in person, it was so nice to go to the pub together afterwards, and you could just, let the ideas settle a little bit. So that's what we're trying to replicate. Awesome. Over to you, Chloe.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Can see sort of lots of colourful blobs. Excellent. Oh, sorry. Apologies. Okay. So we luckily this week, it's actually quite nice sometimes to not have a book because it means that we can focus in on a few, particularly on this one concept, and hopefully kind of break it out a little bit, see it from some different angles. For those of you who did have a look at the readings, there are a couple of different ones. So there was a case study on the EU, case study on Scotland, and then some other pieces of work which sort of built on those. So what really came out of those readings, and something to bear in mind today, is there are so many different definitions of the just transition.
Chloe, are you, sorry to interrupt, did you mean to share your screen?
Can you not see? Can you not see?
No, it's gone again.
Just
oh no. Okay, thank you. Let's try again. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, do shout if you can't hear me or if there are issues like that. Okay, so there are multiple definitions. So we have this very expansive definition, which we are perhaps relatively familiar with, which has its roots in the civil rights movement, and is essentially the idea that you can't just shift from an extractive to a regenerative economy just on the basis of stopping fossil fuels and switching to renewable energy. You really need to address the roots of inequality, and that means the real economic and social restructuring. So it had roots in the civil rights movement. It's really built by labour unions and environmental justice groups, and came from these workers themselves. So there was this idea from them that there is a real need to transition away from jobs that are harming the planet. So this was mentioned in the climate justice transition, also by the Scotland's JTC. I'm going to refer to it as now because it's a bit of a mouthful. And there is also here, which I haven't mentioned, particularly the idea of reparations. The far more narrow definition, which also came out of the readings, is that the just transition actually is just state support to support communities and workers who are going to lose their livelihoods due to the shift away from fossil fuels. So this comes up in discussions where people are trying to broaden out the debate from the idea that the energy transition is anything other than technical and actually just needs to move to social justice. So we're really going to see this when we're talking about the EU example, although there's Scotland's JTC also does mention this. So moving on to the first case study, the JTC, I will say it for one time and then I'll stop saying it. Just Transition Commission is an independent commission, and it was set up in 2018 in Scotland to advise on transitioning all sectors of the Scottish economy to become net zero and more inclusive. So one of the readings was this comparative perspective that Anna posted, which was a lot more about how the concept was rolled out in different countries. We also then had the full report to read through in March of this year, which I'm going to focus on a little bit more because it's slightly more about what really happened in Scotland and what the intention was. So as you can already kind of hear from what I've begun to say, this is perhaps, well, in my opinion, quite a contradiction between the two different concepts. You have the broad transition. They're really trying to think about how to transition all different sectors of the economy. But essentially, this report was produced for Scottish ministers, so quite state-led, and there is a focus on different sectors, but also on oil, which is a big deal for Scotland. So it was put together through quite an impressive consultation process. And as I've already mentioned, basically the purpose of it was to produce practical, independent, affordable recommendations, which is slightly at odds with this really broad and commendable task that they were trying to give themselves, which is really an all sector transformation. So there was lots and lots in the document, and apologies because policy can sometimes, you feel like you're wading through it. So to bring out 4 things that they said, these are our key recommendations. 1, pursue an orderly managed transition to net zero that creates benefits and opportunities for people all across Scotland. So we're talking about farmers as well, people like that, rather than just high energy transition workers. Also equipping people with the skills and education they need to benefit from the transition, empowering and invigorating communities and strengthening local economies, as well as then sharing benefits widely, ensuring the burdens are distributed. So we do actually get in slightly the idea of reparations there, which is quite interesting. So there's reams and reams of this, some really beautiful policies and really ambitious aims. And I think something that I was trying to look for is what is the purpose of this policy? And I think where I was most convinced by this was here. So it's key organising principle for climate policy making in Scotland and embedded across different government strategies and across departments. So something to take on to later and points to reflect on, is this unrealistic? The Commission is actually now being wound down. There's a bit of debate on this on Twitter between the SNP and Labour, because it's not quite certain exactly what's happening, but basically it's not certain its future. How useful is something that's this ambitious? A little controversial question, can this be implemented with Scotland still part of the UK? And to give the other part of this debate, could this be implemented if Scotland was part of the EU? Would it be any easier? Would it be more difficult? And is this just too much to cover? So as I said, this was made for Scottish ministers. It didn't really talk about the whole societal wide transition and the other actors that we really need and what their role would be. And I mean, just such a huge project. It wants to mitigate injustices that may arise because of climate change and address existing inequalities. So a lot to reflect on when we come back to the room. Rigged feeds into this. So this was another reading or material that Anna posted, and this was a documentary put together by Greenpeace, which was based on interviews with oil rig workers in Scotland. It explored obstacles to them switching industry, and particularly about how oil goes through these big boom, big bust phases that really affects the life of the workers, as well as the economic prospects of Scotland. So potentially something else to take into the discussion rooms is, if you have watched this, I thought it presented a very infinitely preferable perception of working on a wind farm, which perhaps we should question a little bit, is whether people who have been working in oil will still want to be working with renewable energies. So moving on to the EU case study. Sorry, I'm whipping through this. I'm trying to maximize time for discussion. So
you're doing beautifully, Chloe.
Thank you. So this reading was based on the European Union's Just Transition Mechanism. And this is very different from the Scotland example. It's a framework to provide financial resources and technical advice. It's very much based on this narrow definition of what the just transition is. It's specifically for countries and regions that are facing the greatest challenges to phasing out fossil fuels. Poland and Germany are mentioned quite frequently, and we're not even talking about all high energy industries. We're particularly talking about coal because of the immediate effects that the job losses are going to have in those countries over the next few years. So in terms of implementation, it also is, it sounds pretty good, based on the fact that it's already embedded in EU policies. So recipients have to develop their own national transition plans for these funds to be released and approved by the Commission. Something that I found a little bit interesting about the EU case study is that they distance themselves from the civil rights concept of the origin of the just transition, and actually say that this whole basis, this whole policy, is based on concepts of social justice and transnational collaboration that have informed European policymaking for decades, which is, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but interesting to disassociate yourself from the broader just transition movement, and perhaps maybe, as our discussion might lead to, maybe this is a good thing with the concept becoming more and more enlarged. So a quick run through the mechanism itself, because it gets a little bit kind of technical. One is really just to support economic diversification by investing in a whole range of different areas. So SMEs, a creation of new firms, clean energy. So that's one of the elements of it. The second one is basically, there's a thing called Invest EU, which is essentially a way for the European government to give government-backed loans, so they're far more secure than other loans, but they want these investments to come from private and public sector entities. And then a pure public sector loan facility that would be put into sectors that we quite often associate with perhaps a slight with the just transition even. So energy and transport infrastructure, heating, energy efficiency measures. So again, perhaps something to think about on the back of this is it starts off talking about coal, and by the time it goes to the mechanism itself, it's going into quite broader, in my opinion, quite expansive areas, talking about social infrastructure. And actually perhaps thinking quite hard about how those communities are going to be affected by the phase out of coal. So a couple of thoughts to finish on for this section. This is very top down. This has really disassociated itself with the civil rights movement, with this idea that actually it's the workers who are going to define best, going to know best what they want out of this. The plan completely lacks any detail on dialogue with unions and the workers themselves. It's very specific to a particular high energy transition. So although I've talked about the merits that might have, this is very far removed from that expansive definition of the just transition, which says we cannot just replace what we have at the moment with a different form of producing energy. And there is already within this a conflict between EU and national levels. So I've just explained how the mechanism works, and that it actually really needs nations to define their own plans. But the member states who are involved in this, Germany and Poland, are two examples of whom do not want to phase coal out by 2030. So how that's actually going to work, it might be a little bit problematic. There is also one final point about the money for this has been greatly reduced. And this is something that is across the EU mechanism, although this has got more funds available than the Scottish one. So we have a lot to maybe think about here, the different points from both the Scottish example and the EU example. So I will stop there, and then I think we could maybe take that away, as well as maybe just go into breakout rooms with one question, which is, in what way is a just transition useful?
Thanks, Chloe, so much. That was so clear and valuable. So thank you. I think we'll just stay in the one room, if that makes sense for everybody. So yeah, going back on how useful is this concept, given that it's kind of gone through various different iterations and is interpreted in different ways by different organizations, perhaps with slightly different agendas. Does anyone want to kickstart on what their thoughts are in light of what Chloe's just said, or your own knowledge from different spaces?
Could you put the standing question into the chat just so we can reflect on it?
Yeah, of course.
I can also, if it would be useful to share the mural, I can do that again.
Yeah, Chloe, I can share it just now. It's also a good idea, so we can have a little reminder.
From my perspective, I actually didn't know about the kind of historical concept of just transition. I was only really familiar with it from a kind of government policy kind of perspective, and more so recently, certainly in the last 5 years since the report was published. So it was really interesting to hear about the wider concept of the topic, and in terms of in what way is it useful. I think it's useful because there is a need to transition, and give, to meet our net zero and climate targets. So it's useful to define it, but ultimately, if everyone's using a different definition of it, then you can kind of question how useful it is in that respect.
Yeah, definitely, I echo that. And something that comes to mind is the Build Back Better slogan, which Boris Johnson very effectively adopted after this huge campaign, and what happens when there is the adoption of language without necessarily the adoption of what stands behind it. Catherine, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to reflect on, just from the experience of the wellbeing economy term. In a way, I think it's probably inevitable that a lot of ideas, when they gain prominence and people start resonating them with those terms, for whatever reason, they are going to be taken up by different actors with different perspectives and utilized. And I think in a way that may not be okay and it may be problematic, but I'm not sure how much sort of control those of us behind certain terms can exercise over that. And I think maybe it's just a stage of an idea's evolution. I mean, the same with sustainability, degrowth even. I was just reading a really interesting article just this evening on, people tussling over the idea of the definition of degrowth and what it means and all the different interpretations, even something I think is relatively specific as degrowth. So I wonder if, just sort of, I guess that's sort of part two of your question, Anna, is sort of what does it demand that actors can do and respond and maintain conceptual integrity as something gets broader take-up?
I think that kind of co-opting isn't always bad. And I hear what you say, Catherine, and certainly on the Build Back Better, it was toe curling. But actually, if people begin to pick up on the concepts, and as long as it's defined each time it's used, so that when it's being used, it is very clear what they are defining and using within that jurisdiction. It isn't necessarily about dilution. It will be sometimes, and keeping an eye on that and calling it out is not unhelpful. But I quite often think we get too hung up on those kinds of definitions, and very often that is done by people to discredit the concept. So rather than talking about just transition, they talk about whether you've pinched the label from somewhere else, so that conversation is then shifted from the thing you actually want to talk about. And so I'm generally less concerned about labels as long as it's not mislabeling. And just transition across Europe is, I was really interested in your summary, and when I first read it, I thought about it. I was involved a little bit in, there was a citizen assembly in, Baden-Württemberg, which is where VW cars are made. And there they were looking very specifically at the transition in the motor industry, which is obviously huge for Germany. And it was being run by the Greens, who happened to be in control in that bit of Germany. And there was a really interesting approach, because almost the whole workforce in the particular area is related and supported by the motor industry. So that conversation with not just the people who were directly involved, but the bigger area and the whole shape of the economy there actually proved to be really helpful, I think.
Yeah, they're really interesting insights. Thanks, Doreen. And something that's coming to my mind in light of that is this trade-off between something being all-encompassing, including food sovereignty and agriculture and loads of different sectors, and not just workers, but also communities.
Yes.
It's kind of theoretically really potentially really nice and really inclusive, but also as a policymaker, at some point, I don't know if this is something I should be saying when it's being recorded, but like, you do have to prioritize. You have to think, where can we make the biggest impacts with a certain amount of resources, or where do we need to prioritize? And focusing on, say, coal workers is perhaps a legitimate thing to do. Jonathan or Lucy, I don't know if you have any thoughts, or Chloe as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear. I think it's been summarised really well. And I'm just bouncing from what I've been listening to the last hour in Bolan's group as well, which was very much on transition, or rather the fact that if we don't have a transition, we'll be made to have one, and it will be far less comfortable. So I am less concerned about people using terms that they're on a journey with. That's definitely something that happens in my work, and I'm okay with it. I used to get really nervous about it, and now I don't. The other thing I would reflect on very much, that transition. So I work a lot with agriculture and food, and those global supply chains that we have now across Scotland are actually really useful ways of engaging across an entire system, given that we need system change. And I think people get really nervous about doing that, particularly with food. It's a really emotional subject for lots of people, and it's a very difficult one to have, but it's, so far, I have found, has been a really useful way to engage. I think it's very difficult to bring up some massive change subjects, and supply chain, and through the right partners in that supply chain and value chain is definitely an easy way. Just my experience in the short amount of time that I've been doing it.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think probably needs quite a lot of mulling over, but it's different dimensions of all the different sort of playing fields, whether you're thinking about national systems or corporation systems or global systems. Yeah,
and that shift to global to local, and when we were summarising earlier, we were talking about, just those shifts of just switching off. Like I grew up in a mining village in the 80s in Derbyshire, and now live in an ex-mining village in East Ayrshire. I don't ever want to see anybody have to go through anything like that again, and yet I see it on the horizon. I see it for lots of industries, including food, if we don't start to take some steps. And so that I'm really interested in that, learning from what has happened before and listening to those voices as to what was needed to shape policy that's going to be needed. The other thing I think is you can't get away from the fact that policy needs to be more integrated. As hard as it is, it needs to be more integrated. You can't have agriculture separate to food, separate to energy, separate to communities. So
yeah, 100%. I feel like that might be a perfect segue to hand over to Lara, who has done a lot, or is thinking a lot about the meanings of justice and how to apply them to different spaces and across different dimensions. So by way of a slightly more proper introduction, I mean, thanks so much for joining, Lara, because I know that you've been on the move a lot in the past few days. Lara's a doctoral researcher now through the Energy Technology Partnership at the University of Edinburgh and the European Marine Energy Centre. So her research focuses on the justice dimensions of emerging renewable energy technologies and their processes of innovation, investigated through frameworks of energy justice, just transitions, and responsible research and innovation. Just a shout out to Lara. I mean, she basically designed a PhD that she wanted to do and then created it and is now doing it. So yeah, credit to your degree of passion and commitment to this space, Lara, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. I know that you are very much like, oh, you know, not an expert, want to contribute to the conversation, but not be kind of put on a pedestal. And I think that speaks volumes to the fact that you share values very much with WEAll and it being about knowledge sharing. So thanks for joining.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks
And
for
do tell us where you are in Orkney.
in Stromness.
Ah.
So mainland Orkney, the big one. But
I love Orkney. Sorry, I interrupted. Go on.
No, not at all. And thanks Anna and Chloe and everyone else for having me. It's very much early days in my PhD. I only started a few weeks ago, but I did some of this research a couple of years ago as well. So it's very much something that I'm constantly engaging with. Can everybody see my my screen okay? Yep, great. So that was actually a really great segue, because when there's so many terms around justice, and I do think there's a risk of jargon washing or people becoming disillusioned, but what really maybe shouldn't be generalized is the method and how we scrutinize that method, and having a few pillars of an approach that is flexible, but that we can adapt, but that has those justice pillars in it. And that's kind of what I'm going to touch on today, because jargon will be generalized, as it has been said. So hopefully I'll touch on some of the context as to justice and energy. Also, my focus is on energy, but so this will be on energy, but obviously the just transition spans beyond that sector, as we've already said. And I'll just provide a few case studies of different models of justice that we can probably discuss later. So just to start off with, there was traditionally a dichotomy between the social and the technical when it comes to different infrastructure sectors. So construction or software and digital technologies and energy. These were usually relegated until a few decades ago just to engineering and economics mainly. And there was a decision quite organically to just a need to bridge that gap in academia and increasingly in policy, because there was an understanding that energy across its life cycle is what we are today. And if we take that statement to be true for a second, then a really interesting proposition comes up, which is that we can really transform our society as we transform our energy system by changing how we extract, use, and almost define energy. And this is why I'm also particularly interested in this topic. And what this really means to me is that energy is a determinant. And there's plenty of perspectives that look at this, but the one that really took it home to me is how energy has historically determined geopolitical realities worldwide, and really hierarchies of power across societies, across cultures, etc. And some of this research looks at colonialism and the slave trade, and how individuals were literally extracted from their geographies, their homes, their cultures, and transported elsewhere to be used as fuel on plantations. And if we think about how those historical actions stemming from access to energy have then determined our global realities worldwide, we start to notice that, at least for me, energy just isn't some stuff in the ground that has been forming for millions of years and has carbon emissions or electrons on a grid, but it really becomes an enabler that allows individuals and societies to gain or to profit, in this case, from plantations. And it also comes at a cost, and it will always have impacts, in this case, the horrendous cost of slavery. So if energy is loaded with process and meaning, there also start to be some clear correlations between climate change and energy processes, and also global inequalities. So just as in quick example of the metrics that most of us will likely be familiar with. The map on the top is energy consumption per capita, and the darker areas are in the global north. And then the map on the bottom is the worldwide distributional impacts of climate change and future climate risks. And the countries with least access to energy are the ones that are already being most affected. So these are just a couple of the metrics that that already start to show these dimensions at a global and a local scale. So if to date we've developed at the cost of other social and natural ecosystems, by transforming our energy system, we have a huge opportunity to also transform our social realities. But also, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this later, I believe we really have a need to do so, because if we continue to extract energy and deploy renewable energy sources and everything else in the same linear processes that we've done to date, we're only really going to perpetuate the inequalities and the cultures and the value systems that have led us to the climate crisis and to our current social inequalities. So I really think this is an opportunity we need to take also for our survival, not just from an ethical and a moral perspective, which is imperative. So this is where, in this vein, the just transition term really comes to the fore in relation to the energy transition. And the just transition goes beyond energy and that expansive definition that Chloe was talking about. And then there's the narrower definition that talks just about workers. But as the term is evolving in nature, and the broader definition seems still slightly overwhelming because we don't seem to have certainty on how it really applies and what we're looking at, I thought I'd look at how we can really operationalize justice or make these justice impacts in the energy sector tangible through another framework. In academia, there's frameworks and terms for everything. And this one is the Energy Justice Framework, which emerged in 2013. And it basically takes a whole systems view to the energy system and energy processes and understands energy and ourselves as having global and temporal relationships across the life cycle. So it's very much touching on that broader definition of justice and the transition we need to make. And the main proposition framework for energy justice is these three tenets of justice. So distributive, procedural, and recognition. So I thought I'd flag up a couple of case studies touching on these different frameworks, and hopefully that can then lead to some discussion on what a just transition might look like beyond. So the first tenet of justice is distributional justice. And this emerged in the 70s through the environmental justice movement already. And it's very much about what the benefits and the harms are in this case of energy decisions or processes, but also who carries the burdens or receives the gain or the profit. And the example I have up here is around cobalt extraction. So 2/3 of cobalt are located in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we need these for electrification to decarbonize our vehicle fleets and everything else. At the same time, it's being mined at absolutely exponential rates with child labor, worker exploitation, worker slavery, and this market is only growing. So this doesn't make anyone a bad person for having an EV, but it really is a clear example that shows to me how the resource and the energy system is absolutely interdependent worldwide, but also that our actions to decarbonize here will always have other impacts elsewhere, even if we can't see them. And so, for instance, and we might touch on this later when we touch on the scales of the just transition, would it be a just transition for Scotland to have the whole of Scotland to have access for EVs, for instance, if these EVs are sourced from child labor derived batteries? These sorts of controversial conversations around justice is, I think, what we need to start looking at different scales. The second pillar of justice is around recognition justice. And this is really to think about what sections of society are misrepresented or ignored in energy processes. And an example here is not in my backyard term, or the NIMBY term, which really emerged with early onshore wind developments across the UK. And this was used to really label protests against onshore wind as self-interested and misinformed individuals. And it really delegitimized local protests, and it made people seem like they didn't care about climate change and that they were just interested in their own gain. But actually, a lot of research in recent years has shown that this term fails to recognize the sincerity of loads of people's concerns, but also that often these concerns were really altruistic and they were based on just demands for fair and equal respect or treatment that they felt they hadn't received from developers, etc. So by using the NIMBY term to just categorize everyone in the same bag in these protests, this was actually undermining attempts at open-minded discussion and compromise for these developments. So this was a clear case of misrecognition that emerged. And the third pillar of justice is procedural justice. So this one's really about how decisions are being made and who is included in them. And it underlies these other two pillars of justice, and it thinks about the method of how we're going to carry this transition forward. So this includes examples like, do fuel poverty definitions really include people that are fuel poor and include their testimonies and their experiences? Or if I'm developing a new technology and I put out a consultation for the community, can people really engage with that consultation and understand what it's saying so that they can reply? And so these sorts of lenses are what will increase in democracy around energy decision making, and hopefully it will increase engagement and empowerment. So some of the mechanisms that have been flagged as being useful are using local knowledge, but also greater information disclosure that's accessible, for instance. And a lot of these examples have been quite dramatic, although they are real, but it's not all bad. And I thought I'd flag that in my master's research, where I did a lot of policy document analysis and a few interviews, I found that community energy in Scotland is really perceived to be, when properly deployed, an effective energy scheme with justice considerations. And it doesn't mean all energy schemes need to be community energy, but it is a model that we can learn from. And this is because it distributes responsibility, but it also targets local community needs, and a lot more voices are heard. And it also increases democracy and decision-making. So it empowers the citizens around the community energy wind turbine, for instance, around what energy is, but also enhances collaboration and consensus building. Another challenge with this, for instance, is that community energy is always quite small scale. So how can we scale this up? How can we learn from these schemes that work and scale up to national or even transnational scales? So the transition will happen. We need to respond to climate change, and there will always be trade-offs. But I think the just transition term is a concept that's really useful despite all the chaos around its definition sometimes, because it's putting on the table that there's space for dialogue and to change the way we've done things to date. So I'll just finish off with this quote. Thank you all for listening. I find this quote really encompasses what the broader definition of just transition or energy justice looks for, which is that a just transformation of our socio-energy system is a decision to live in a different type of society, not just a low carbon version of the new one. So thanks all for listening, and I look forward to everyone's thoughts and to the discussion.
That was magical. Thanks so much, Lara. It was so rich. I don't even know where to begin. Chloe, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, there was so much in there. I think one question that kind of came to mind, it was just at the end, and I think definitely something that I don't feel like I've really figured out at all with the just transition is, it's so nice to hear of a community energy kind of program working and fulfilling the pillars. But it's quite interesting to hear about like policy documents that relate to that, because I guess it would just be great to hear a bit more about that kind of element of your research, in terms of, I guess, where I see a contradiction with the just transition is, I guess, kind of like what I tried to bring out in the mural a little bit, and having these quite top down, some of them not even having much consultation at all. And then the fact that you're reading policy documents and kind of, saw that this was working, because my understanding was more of the grassroots, more of the community energy was without that sort of level of government involvement. So it'd be great to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my just as a quick disclaimer, my research was also quite top down in that it was policy documents and then it was interviews with MSPs. It wasn't with local people in community energy schemes or anything else. It was about how social justice was understood in Scottish energy policy. So it was within those frameworks. But what I saw was not necessarily linked to the just transition term, but I saw an evolution in Scottish policy documents where community engagement a few years back, I can't remember exactly when, was in developer documents termed to be a potential issue or conflict. And it moved on to a few just recently in recent bills that came through. Community participation was encouraged, and it was seen as something that would give you higher points in order to achieve, for instance, to be granted a development. So reading between the lines, there seems to be an evolution in Scottish policy and how community engagement is understood as, instead of being an issue, it's actually actively encouraged for developers to engage in that. And then throughout interviews, I interviewed 6 policymakers from different backgrounds and different parties and ideological backgrounds, and everybody in different stages, without being directly asked, really had this feel that the community and the consumer needed to be engaged with energy. And when that happened, they'd seen very close positive results. So some were directly involved in some local energy schemes because they were trying to support them. Others just had this perception and they weren't that close to the topic, but it just emerged quite organically in perceptions.
Thank you.
Doreen, do you want to jump in?
Thank you so much. That really was very clear. And full declaration here, I've led public local inquiries against wind farms. In my real world, I'm an archaeologist. So I led my team to oppose the wind farms on the centre of the mainland in Orkney. Because the setting of the World Heritage Site there is a natural bowl. So just put that on the table. My real world now, if you like, is picking up exactly what you just talked about. The work I do in open government is trying to shift how we think about what consultation means in all aspects of how we're working. And our new government plan has, for the first time, picked up a commitment, and it's not even written yet, but around climate change and climate action, so that after COP, the team will go out and basically co-produce with civil society in Scotland and activists the next steps of how we look at taking the just transition work and thinking about what are the practical things that can be done. It won't happen overnight and it won't be instant, but the shift into recognising the value of things like citizen assemblies, things like providing proper deliberative spaces for these things to happen. I really, and they can be of all sorts of different scales. There's no, citizen assemblies are just one way of doing that. My most direct involvement in putting an energy community energy base in place was also in Orkney, in Westray, where the local community have own. They bought a little bit of land off the farmer and then put in a grant to put up their wind turbine, which has transformed the island. It's transformed almost everybody's lives on the island, and that's really how it should be. So they aren't a net suckers out from the world. They are you know, in control of that aspect of their lives. But I was really interested in how you're thinking about what the next steps in this might be, how we get that conversation, the cobalt conversation, really onto the table without frightening people. And I don't mean that in a silly way. I mean, there is a real concern around people closing down when they understand the impact that they're having, so that the conversation just gets defensive, and how we move into the space where you can properly share evidence and understanding, so that people don't respond in that way. The French Climate Assembly, about a third of the people have reported being depressed afterwards, because they haven't seen the action they wanted from their government. They put out really radical proposals, and Macron said, "Oh yes, we'll take all of these," and then said, "Well, perhaps not." So it's having that honest conversation in a way that is productive, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think there's a huge risk there. I mean, I think there's a huge risk as consumers that every day we hear one thing and then I had it recently with sustainable, I don't know, recycled polyester. At first it was everywhere and all brands were great. And then you suddenly realize you're destroying the environment by buying clothes with recycled polyester in them. And so you don't really know where to go. And I think that's where a point that Chloe also raised in her mural earlier also comes in, which is that we really need all actors in society to work together for this. So if the government is telling us one thing, but then we've got greenwashing on the other side in part of the private sector, but then we've got part of the private sector being even more ambitious than government. And then and we don't really know what information to trust or to go for. I think that's where that risk really becomes tangible, because if we know about the cobalt situation, for instance, but then there's legislation that if you go and buy an electric vehicle, there's legislation that mandates that they show you the pathway of the supply chain, for instance. And then there's the tools that exist that enable supply chains to show that pathway, for instance. Then all the system starts to come together so that the consumer can be empowered, and so can all the other systems across the life cycle. I'm making this up as I go along, by the way. I don't know if that would work, but I think that's where someone in the call, and I can't remember who, it might have been Lucy, was saying that policy needs to be more integrated. And I think everything needs to be more integrated, because everything is, and otherwise there is a real risk that as people and individuals, we just get eco anxiety and just quit. But it won't come to that.
No.
Let's be optimistic about this.
Sorry, I'm on my phone, so I'm going to put my physical hand up. Just really recognise some of what Doreen had said, and then Lara as well. I really worry when we start to have conversations. I have conversations with people who, they just want it fixed. I'm a regulator. I'm meant to just be able to, get that fixed. But actually the complexity, some of the complexity, the kind of thing that Lara's explained earlier, if you can build the space, if you can create the space to have that conversation and to open out and to really delve into those supply chains and things, then people get engaged and you don't get inertia. But if you can't create those spaces, people just get frustrated that nothing's happening, or they don't know which way to go. And that's when you get inertia. And inertia is the bit that worries me the most, because those first steps are really important. I don't really mind if they're not quite in the right direction. Just getting some momentum going first to then get some changes we really need is where I think my work can sit. But the inertia worries me a lot. And I think you're right. People absolutely, when they don't know where to go and they don't know which bit of information to trust, that's when it's worse.
Yeah, Chloe.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't seem to raise my virtual hand. Not good for flow of discussion. Apologies. Yeah, I just building on what all three of you have said. I actually find it amazing, Doreen, that those discussions are happening kind of close to the government. And I think something I'm talking particularly about the whole like going back to this cobalt example, and I think it's just so refreshing. You know, in none of the examples that were in the reading had anything, you know, the concept was there, right, of just transition, and it being, you know, based on some Latin American principles such as buen vivir, and bringing in a global just transition. But then the documents themselves, right, the EU one, the Scotland one, didn't have that discussion anywhere in mind. And actually, you know, if you just said, if that is forgotten, and if nations are focusing like this, and it, you know, there are, as we've said, there are definite benefits of focusing in particular, and the diverse meanings. But yeah, I just wanted to hear a little bit more, Doreen, on that, and how serious those discussions were, because I find that amazing.
Which particular?
So the whole idea that there were discussions within Scottish government of, okay, we can't have just transition in Scotland if our batteries are coming from, and the cobalt within them is coming from
certainly within government there is a real acknowledgement of that we can't just deal with what's in front of us, and that we need to look beyond. You won't see it in official documents because they're very sensitive discussions, and they are the sorts of things that there needs to be a real way of having that kind of discussion actually almost generating itself in the society. What we've been talking about is that really important element of government operating in a way that it can host discussions and can be the place where we can begin to generate all sorts of scales and sizes and shapes of discussions in places. So I think and in fact I advised when the Just Transition work first started, that they didn't start with a big grown-up commission, that they actually went out and looked at our geographies and the main themes, and had discussions around those. And I think there's a lot of energy to come back and do that now, and properly think about not the Citizen Assembly on climate change has been really powerful, I think, in Scotland, and we'll see what I'm not in that policy team, so I don't know what they'll come out with, but they are taking it seriously. The government is going to give a serious response to it, and all of these things help shape. But we need to be able to encourage the production of trusted sources of data and information. There's no shortage. How long is it now since the Club of Rome produced their first science report? There are wonderful organizations like WEAll that can have all of that evidence on hand. But one of the things that the participants in the Citizen Assembly said was, we have no idea of this sort of thing. The public discourse about it is really so superficial, and it's just about we'll either take from you or we'll take from you. So that the conversation about that much broader idea of justice really needs to be had. And the children's element of our Citizen Assembly, so 100 children around Scotland fed into policy work around just transition. They were absolutely shocked by the international dimension of this. They had no idea, and why would they? Because nobody would tell them. And that had a real impact on them. So as we begin to increase having that knowledge and having much more honest discussions, trusted sources of information, that we can all point to. The guy who set up Independent Sage, David King, Professor King, is just setting up a similar version for climate science, simply because the Indie Sage has been seen as a very trusted source of information about the pandemic. And he said, well, you know, we just need that now for most people in the population to have access to the information that, for goodness sake, is there.
It's really interesting that you would say that, though, because thinking to consulting with businesses, I mean, one of the main issues is lack of access to data. They just have no idea what is actually going on in their supply chains. And that, so in one sense, there is the data, but in another sense, the specifics perhaps don't exist in the hands of the people who need them to make informed decisions. But another thing that's come to mind is the just transition I associate as being a very policy community oriented word rather than a word, or rather than a term which is ever used in the business community outside of, say, energy or specific sectors. It's not used in the kind of corporate sustainability reporting space. And I wonder if it needs to be for us to put 2 and 2 together in terms of, you know, thinking about electric vehicle supply chains. It needs to enter more into the business sector's awareness. Yeah, who was it, Lucy, was it you or Rachel who listened to Jamie Airbib just before this? Because his perspective is so interesting, in that he is very pro technology as the main solution to decarbonization, which in the WEAll space might be slightly more controversial, but I think is probably a very healthy perspective to bring in for a bit of provocation.
Yeah, I'm challenged by the text. I live rurally, so when somebody wants to tell me that the solutions are all technology driven, it challenges me, but I also love being challenged on that. So so it's James a bit, yeah, there we go, somebody's dropped it in, thank you. So there was somebody else that did TED talk recently, a TEDx talk recently from Glasgow, who was also talking about tech solutions. It always feels really polarized to me. It feels like you've got tech solutions on the one side and almost a look back to the way that we used to live on the other, when I think realistically the solution is far more blended and integrated than maybe where everybody comes from. I find it quite difficult to just buy into the whole tech solutions, but without a doubt, it plays a massive part. For me, I can see it plays a massive part. I don't think it's the first step in transition, though. I think it's such a massive change for, you know, whether it's consumers, whether it's workers, whether it's like unless we really get to that situation where we have that cliff edge drop, I'm not so sure that those big tech solutions are they might be working on them now and there might be a plan to move to them, but I don't see them as being the first step in transition. But I'm really interested in what other people think, because I am very much a rural girl at heart.
Yeah, so one question to everybody then is, do you think that in order to drive a transition, a timely enough transition for us to decarbonize, to make sure that we don't go above 1.5 degrees by 2050 and that we stabilize, do you think that we can do that through a more community-oriented just transition approach, or that it will need to be primarily technology and markets which does that? Because I've read a couple of really interesting articles. I have a couple of friends who are very pro the free market, not the free market approach, but very pro the market driven approach, and think it's that we have got to such a late stage that we cannot afford to convolute almost climate with a broader political ideology. And actually we need to prioritize decarbonization rather than try and make it part of a broader political agenda, which I find very challenging, but very, very interesting. Declan, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I'd be in favor of the former as opposed to the latter. I think that's an undemocratic way of looking at things. I prefer to work on a local, regional, national, and international basis with a group of different organizations in a broad alliance. I think that, you know, I come from a trade union background, and the trade union movement helped develop the just transition concept. I worked at the International Trade Union Confederation in Brussels, where they formed the Just Transition Centre. And I think with the membership that the ITUC has, it's 200 million members or more at this point. And I think that leaving it in the hands of the market is just a way of sort of continuing the system as it is, and we can't afford to do that. I think that part of the reason that we're in this mess is because of those that have controlled the markets in that way, and people need to work from the bottom up and change the consciousness of our societies, and you know that's just not going to do it, and you know I'd be very much against it.
Lara and then Chloe.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I think I agree, Declan. I was going to say, I think it really depends on how we're looking at how we deploy our climate response and what the energy transition will also look like. Because if we arguably, we could say that the way our markets are framed, and we've developed technology to date in the broadest sense of technology and infrastructures, have led us to where we are now. So if we think about linear production processes, and we continue with the cobalt example because it's helpful, if we keep extracting minerals at this rate so that we can really get everybody on EVs, what are we going to do if we haven't developed the systems that really recycle, not just recycle these minerals, but also actually put enough value in recycling these minerals so that there are markets to recycle them, etc. And that is really a change in value systems and in consumption processes. And if we just focus on the market-driven force of technology, I don't think we'll get there. I think we need it. I think we need these technological solutions, but I think it needs to go hand in hand with the realization that we are here now because of what we have done over the last 150 years and how we have done it. And so we need to really look at the methods that we use. And the other point I'd like to raise is that we're all talking about this 1.5 degree 2050, but we can't really forget what this means. There's, I think, a danger that it just becomes a number and that just getting there is what we need to do. But actually there's a climate crisis context to this, and there will be areas that will be worst affected. And there's actually huge opportunities because of the distributed nature of renewable energy and the fact that where it sits is where it has to be, to empower communities that have always been at the end of energy supply chains and that have always been more at risk, and that will also be facing more climate risks. So if we start empowering coastal areas or island nations, for instance, or certain rural areas that are already at the face of climate risks through bottom-up solutions that embed justice in energy technologies and energy access, I think there's a huge resilience opportunity there in the face of the climate change that will come anyway. So I don't think they can be detached from each other. I think we need both. But even though deliberation and engagement takes time, I don't think it can be the cost to technology deployment, because we will likely create new injustices and probably new climate issues as well.
And the one thing that no one really in the world is looking at properly is migration. Because inevitably, we are already at the point that we will be losing huge areas of coastal land, particularly in Asia. And the migration that will create is huge. It's something the world hasn't ever seen. and we are already at the point where that is unstoppable. So that element of justice really needs to be factored in. And it's always a worry to me that we don't, that idea around the sharing the planet more fairly isn't something that we have a better discourse on.
Jonathan, you've been quiet. Do you have any thoughts bubbling under the surface?
I don't think so. I think I'm mostly enjoying the conversation. I work a lot less at a systems level, and much more of my work has to do with flourishing individuals as well. So I'm just really enjoying everyone's contribution here.
Awesome, thanks. Chloe, you had your hand up.
Thank you. I was had something along the lines of what Lara said, but far less eloquent. I think back on the technology point for me, unfortunately, yeah, it's something I really don't find convincing. I think, as Lara said, the many ways that technology, we can't disassociate it from power. I think just very simple examples of Facebook, and even today, YouTube took down it. With anyone knows Novara Media, they suddenly had their whole YouTube channel suspended for no reason. I think it's quite dangerous to make it a technocratic, bureaucratic solution to something which is far from that reality. And I think also what it tends to do is look at climate and carbon, and it's very shallow for a lot of reasons, because it mainly overlooks, well, a few reasons. It overlooks biodiversity crisis, overlooks the pollution crisis. And it also means it's very handy, right? So like, working with the chemicals industry, we know that chemicals and plastics are forecast to expand massively, because now the carbon is going to become more difficult basically to produce fuel. So petrochemicals industry is just going to pump everything into there. So it's very convenient for them that we have so much going on about carbon. We have so much which is linked to the climate, and we fail to broaden that out beyond that. And I just do see technology, unfortunately, yeah, as a continuation of market-based solutions, which we have so much evidence that they don't work. It's amazing that they're still there. And I think also something on the technology point that always gets me as well is what technology are they talking about? Maybe it's just my naivety, but you know, even if we and Lara, you know, put her finger on this as well. I mean, even things like if we switched out of our transport tomorrow with every, you know, things that were far less dirty, it wouldn't solve the problem. If we had, I mean, our carbon capture is nowhere near what it should be able to deal, what it needs to be able to deal with, if we're going to be continuing on the same line. So I find very little that's convincing about it. And I think what Lara said just really rang true about we have, and again, such a Western approach, right, to rationalize something in the form of a number. And the whole point and the whole problem, in my opinion, with where we're heading is an abstraction of nature and of people. As Lara was saying, people as fuel, cheap labor, cheap nature is how we got here. And then putting everything back on a number, to me, seems like a false solution, and something that is very easily ends up back in this jargon that we were all talking about earlier. But again, I would love, it's great if someone has something that can make me change my mind, or yeah, pick up on any of that. So
yeah, I think what I feel, so I'll be honest, I was really quite inspired by the Rethink X report, which James Erbib wrote and has spoken about. And I often feel like this conversation becomes very polarized very quickly, and that there must be a way to utilize there are such cool, exciting, innovative technologies out there, and there must be a way to harness those while taking into account the power dynamics which need addressing, which our current economic system has kind of perpetrated very unhelpfully, which is slightly what I'm exploring through my master's. I mean, Mariana Mazzucato is very pro technology and innovation at the same time, and she's very pro growth at the same time as thinking about power dynamics. So I will try and report back. A quick plug is that we actually have our book club in January. Azim Azhar, who is quite a prominent character in the climate change exponential tech space, is coming to speak about his book called Exponential. So if you'd like to dig into that further, then would welcome you to the January one. Yeah. So one last question before we begin to wrap up or chill out was taking a step back about the more radical ideas of the just transition challenge capitalism entirely. And do you think that that is useful and legitimate and important in the just transition space? You know, because you have policymakers taking on the theme very much within the economic system that we operate in, and then you have these small communities saying actually the just transition cannot be just without us fundamentally challenging capitalism itself. So just a small one to end. Lara, I don't know if you have any initial thoughts, or Declan.
Quite a big question, Anna.
Well,
No, actually, Declan has his hand up. I'll let Declan go, and then.
No, go on ahead first. You were called.
It's just because I know Lara, I can pick on him more easily.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't accept capitalism should exist at all. You know, I'm a socialist, and therefore I think we need to capture the means of production and the means of consumption. And the means of consumption are technological companies such as Facebook, Google, which premise their business model on data and on advertising. But if you look at the technologies more broadly as to what is needed for a just transition, I think we need democratic control of those technologies, because the market doesn't deliver. The response to the COVID crisis was not driven by the market, it was driven by public officials elected. Now, they may not have got it all right, but in principle, it should remain within democratic control. And the democratic control could, you know, I think it radically needs to expropriate and break up the tech companies and take control in such a way that we drive through this emergency situation. So it's more of a just transformation and a just transition, because the just transition is premised on the idea of the existing system. And I don't think it's unrealistic or idealistic to think that we need to change to a different economic model, because it's happened before, and it will happen again. It's just a question of whether we are prepared to wait for planetary destruction to you know, pick up the pieces.
Sadly, apparently we are at the moment. If you look at Scott Morrison anyway today.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that conversation? And we're allowed to disagree, just to say as well.
Ooh.
Yeah, nice quote. I think, yeah, that idea of the just transformation is, I've never heard that phrase. I don't know if you've invented it, Declan, or if it comes from.
Yeah, I kind of did. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but yeah, I'm not going to take credit. It's no copyright.
That's all right. Well, look, I think, why don't we pause for thought? So Declan, just so you know, we said at the start, this book club used to happen in person, so we all used to go to the pub afterwards. So I think what we'll do now is just take 2 or 3 minutes. If you need to go to the bathroom or anything, do that. And if you want to grab a drink, and then we can come back and just have slightly more chilled out, less structured discussion. So,
well, thank you very much. I've been on Zoom since about 7:30 this morning, so I'm going to duck out. Lovely to see you, and thank you for the discussion. And Lara in particular, I'm really interested in seeing where your PhD goes. I think it will be a really interesting contribution. So, and Chloe, thank you for your summary. It was really helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks, Doreen.
Thanks, Doreen.
Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you, Doreen.
Yeah, definitely echo thanks to Chloe and Lara, and to all of you as well. I mean, it's so fab to have all of these different brains come together. So I'm just going to pause the recording and drop off for a minute. So if you'd like to reconvene in 2 minutes or 3 minutes, then let's do that.
See you in a minute.
Great. Thanks, Anna.